History often remembers legends more clearly than it remembers people, and sometimes the legend becomes so powerful that the person quietly disappears behind it. For more than a century, one image has come to define Captain Edward John Smith. It is the image of an aging sea captain standing calmly aboard the world's most famous passenger liner as the final moments unfold around him, choosing to remain with his ship until the very end. It is a story repeated in books, documentaries, films, classrooms, and conversations across generations. Most people recognize it immediately, and few ever stop to ask a remarkably simple question. How much of that story is actually supported by evidence? The answer is more complicated than many people realize. Unlike countless historical figures whose final moments were carefully documented, Captain Smith left behind no personal account of that night. There was no diary describing his last decisions, no farewell letter, no final interview. Everything we believe about his final hours comes from the people who believed they saw him, the officers who worked alongside him, the passengers who crossed paths with him during moments of extraordinary uncertainty, and the official investigations that attempted to reconstruct events after the disaster. Yet those accounts do not always agree. Some witnesses remembered seeing Captain Smith directing the evacuation with remarkable composure until the very last minutes. Others believed they saw him helping passengers reach the lifeboats. Several claimed he returned to the bridge. A few reported seeing him near the wheelhouse as the ship made its final descent. There were even accounts published in newspapers that later proved impossible to verify. As historians examined these testimonies over the decades, a surprising pattern began to emerge. The closer researchers looked, the less certain the final picture became. This does not mean the witnesses were dishonest. Human memory is shaped by stress, perspective, distance, and time. Two honest people can remember the same event differently, especially during moments when every decision unfolds within minutes. That is why serious historical investigation does not rely on a single dramatic story. It compares testimony against testimony, testimony against documented evidence, and evidence against what was physically possible. Captain Smith's final hours have become one of the most enduring historical puzzles of the 20th century precisely because so many pieces fit together imperfectly. Before we can understand what may have happened during those final moments, we must first separate legend from evidence. The image of a captain refusing to abandon his ship has become part of maritime tradition, representing duty, honor, and responsibility. But traditions are not the same as historical proof. Our goal is not to diminish a respected figure, nor is it to defend or accuse him. Our purpose is much simpler and far more difficult. We are going to follow the evidence exactly as it exists today, accepting what historians know, acknowledging what remains uncertain, and resisting the temptation to fill unanswered questions with comforting assumptions. Because somewhere between eyewitness testimony, official records, maritime tradition, and more than 100 years of retelling lies a real man whose final decisions have become inseparable from one of history's greatest disasters. And before we can investigate what happened during his final hours aboard that famous ship, we first need to understand the remarkable career that placed him on its bridge in the first place. Long before his name became permanently linked to one unforgettable night, Edward John Smith had already spent nearly an entire lifetime at sea. He was not a captain who suddenly found himself commanding one of the largest ships ever built. He had earned that responsibility through decades of experience, discipline, and a reputation that inspired confidence among both passengers and the White Star Line. Born in Stoke-on-Trent, England, in 1850, Smith grew up far from the ocean, yet he chose a career that would eventually carry him across the Atlantic hundreds of times. As a young man, he entered the merchant marine during an era when the sea remained one of the world's most demanding professions. Ocean travel depended not only on technical skill but also on judgment, patience, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. Over the years, Smith steadily advanced through the ranks, serving aboard increasingly important vessels until he became one of the company's most respected captains. His reputation extended well beyond navigation. Passengers often described him as courteous, composed, and approachable. Wealthy travelers specifically requested voyages under his command because they believed they were sailing with one of the safest captains in the Atlantic service. Newspapers occasionally referred to him as the millionaire's captain, a reflection of the confidence placed in him by prominent businessmen and influential families who regularly crossed the ocean aboard White Star ships. That confidence did not appear overnight. It was built through years of reliable service, successful voyages, and the absence of major incidents that might have damaged his professional standing. By the time preparations began for the newest flagship of the White Star Line, Smith represented stability at a moment when the company wished to demonstrate the very best of modern ocean travel. Selecting him to command the maiden voyage was more than a routine assignment. It was a statement. Company executives believed the most celebrated passenger liner in the world deserved one of their most experienced captains on its bridge. At 62 years old, Smith was approaching the end of an extraordinary maritime career. Contemporary reports even suggested that retirement might not be far away after completing this prestigious voyage. If true, it would have been a fitting conclusion to decades of service, allowing him to leave the sea while commanding the company's greatest achievement. Those expectations shaped how both crew members and passengers viewed him during the voyage. To many aboard, his presence represented reassurance. His calm demeanor, measured decisions, and long experience created an atmosphere of confidence that matched the ship itself. Looking back today, it is easy to allow history's outcome to reshape our opinion of the man before the disaster. Yet that would ignore an essential principle of historical investigation. We must judge people according to what was known at the time, not according to what later generations already understand. Before the collision, Captain Smith was not remembered as a controversial figure. He was regarded as one of Britain's most accomplished merchant captains, trusted with lives, valuable cargo, and the reputation of one of the world's leading shipping companies. That is precisely what makes the events that followed so compelling. A man whose career had been defined by confidence and experience would soon face decisions unlike any he had encountered before, decisions made not with the benefit of hindsight but within rapidly changing circumstances where information remained incomplete and time was becoming increasingly precious. Everything that history remembers about him would ultimately be measured against the choices he made during those final hours at sea. By the evening of April 14, 1912, nothing about the voyage appeared unusual to the thousands of people on board. The sea was remarkably calm, the weather was clear, and the atmosphere throughout the ship reflected the confidence that had defined the crossing from the very beginning. Captain Smith had spent the previous days carrying out the responsibilities expected of a commanding officer aboard a premier passenger liner. He met distinguished guests, supervised routine operations, consulted with senior officers, and maintained the steady rhythm that characterized transatlantic travel. Like every experienced captain crossing the North Atlantic in spring, he was also receiving wireless reports from other ships describing fields of drifting ice farther west. Such reports were not extraordinary. Ice warnings were a familiar part of Atlantic navigation, and merchant captains regularly adjusted their awareness according to changing conditions. Historical records confirm that several messages reached the ship throughout the day, although not every report followed the same path through the chain of communication. Some reached the bridge directly, while others were handled by the wireless operators, whose primary responsibility was transmitting passenger messages alongside navigational traffic. What Captain Smith knew at any exact moment remains one of the most carefully examined questions in the entire investigation. Evidence shows that he was aware ice had been reported somewhere along the route, but historians continue to debate precisely which warnings he personally reviewed and when he received them. Shortly before the collision, Smith reportedly visited the bridge, discussed weather conditions with his officers, and then retired, leaving standing instructions to be informed if conditions changed significantly. It was a routine decision, not an unusual one, because experienced officers remained on watch throughout the night. Then, at approximately 11:40 in the evening, everything changed within moments. A lookout spotted an iceberg directly ahead and immediately sounded the warning bell. The bridge reacted quickly, ordering evasive maneuvers while the engines were adjusted in an attempt to avoid a direct impact. The ship did not strike the iceberg head-on. Instead, it brushed along the ice before continuing forward. To many passengers, the sensation felt surprisingly mild. Some noticed only a slight vibration beneath their feet. Others barely interrupted their conversations. There was no immediate sense that history had just taken a different course. Captain Smith returned to the bridge almost immediately after being informed that the ship had made contact with ice. At first, there was no visible chaos. Instead, there was uncertainty. The first priority was not evacuation but understanding the extent of the damage. Reports began arriving from officers inspecting the lower compartments, each bringing fragments of information rather than a complete picture. Soon afterward, Captain Smith met with the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, whose intimate knowledge of the vessel made his assessment especially important. Andrews inspected the affected areas personally before returning with a conclusion that would alter every decision made from that moment forward. According to multiple survivor accounts and later testimony, Andrews informed the captain that the damage extended across too many watertight compartments for the ship to remain afloat indefinitely. Although the exact words exchanged between the two men have never been preserved, historians broadly agree on the significance of that conversation. Within a remarkably short period, Captain Smith faced a reality no commander ever wished to hear. The newest and most celebrated passenger liner in the world could not be saved. From that point onward, every order he gave would no longer be about completing a voyage. It would be about managing time itself, because the question was no longer whether the ship would survive, but how much time remained before it no longer could. Once the full implications of Thomas Andrews' assessment became clear, every minute acquired a value that could never be recovered. The bridge was no longer focused on navigation across the Atlantic but on organizing the safest possible evacuation under conditions that had never been rehearsed on such a scale. Captain Smith immediately began issuing orders through his senior officers, instructing them to uncover the lifeboats, assemble passengers, and prepare for an orderly departure. Historical testimony consistently suggests that his objective was to avoid panic. At that stage, many passengers still did not believe the situation was life-threatening. The ship remained brightly illuminated, the decks appeared stable, and there was little outward evidence that the vessel was slowly taking on water below the surface. Convincing people to leave the apparent safety of a massive ocean liner and step into comparatively small wooden lifeboats proved more difficult than many later imagined. Several early boats left with empty seats because passengers hesitated, uncertain whether evacuation was truly necessary. Captain Smith moved between different areas of the ship, speaking with officers, checking the progress of preparations, and adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. Survivor testimony places him on multiple sections of the boat deck throughout this period, although the exact sequence of his movements remains impossible to reconstruct with complete certainty. Some witnesses remembered him giving calm instructions to officers responsible for loading the lifeboats. Others recalled brief conversations in which he emphasized that women and children should be given priority. His words were practical rather than dramatic, reflecting the responsibilities of a man attempting to manage an increasingly complex situation. Meanwhile, the officers themselves interpreted long-standing maritime traditions in slightly different ways. This helps explain why lifeboat procedures were not always identical on both sides of the ship. Historians have noted that differences in judgment, uncertainty about the boat's carrying capacity, and the rapidly evolving conditions all influenced how evacuation unfolded. These variations should not automatically be interpreted as disorder. Rather, they illustrate how experienced professionals were forced to make difficult decisions with incomplete information while time steadily disappeared. Throughout the evacuation, Captain Smith faced another challenge that is often overlooked. Communication aboard a ship of that size depended entirely on people carrying messages from one location to another. There were no modern communication systems capable of providing instant updates across every deck. Reports reached the bridge in fragments, requiring constant reassessment of priorities. Decisions had to be made based on information that was accurate one moment and outdated the next. Even today, historians continue examining whether any alternative choices might have produced different outcomes, yet those questions are inevitably shaped by hindsight. Captain Smith did not possess the complete picture available to later investigators. He acted within the limits of what he and his officers could observe as events unfolded around them. As more lifeboats entered the water and the list of the ship became increasingly noticeable, the atmosphere gradually changed. Passengers who had initially hesitated now recognized the growing urgency. Crew members worked continuously to launch the remaining boats while wireless operators continued sending distress calls into the night, hoping another vessel would arrive in time. Amid this enormous effort, eyewitnesses repeatedly described Captain Smith as remaining composed, but those same accounts become increasingly fragmented as the final lifeboats departed. His responsibilities had shifted from directing a controlled evacuation to confronting a situation where options were rapidly disappearing. And it is at precisely this point in the historical record, after many of the surviving witnesses had already left aboard the lifeboats, that the evidence surrounding his final movements begins to separate into competing and often contradictory accounts. From this point forward, the historical record becomes noticeably less certain. As the remaining lifeboats pulled away from the ship, they also carried away many of the people who could have witnessed Captain Smith's final movements. Unlike the earlier stages of the evacuation, where multiple officers and passengers described similar events, the last minutes produced a collection of accounts that often overlapped, occasionally conflicted, and sometimes proved impossible to verify. This is where careful historical investigation becomes essential, because repeating the most dramatic story is far easier than weighing the reliability of every witness. One group of survivors remembered seeing Captain Smith near the bridge, continuing to supervise the evacuation as long as it remained possible. Their descriptions portray a man who never abandoned his responsibilities, calmly moving among his officers while encouraging them to continue loading the remaining boats. These testimonies align with the image that has become deeply rooted in maritime tradition, yet even among these witnesses, the exact location and timing differ. Another group believed they saw him walking across the boat deck after most of the lifeboats had already departed. According to these accounts, he appeared composed, speaking only briefly before disappearing from view. Some later recalled that he returned toward the bridge, while others believed he headed in the direction of the wheelhouse. None of these witnesses remained close enough to observe what happened afterward. Then there are the reports that have generated the greatest debate among historians. A few individuals claimed that Captain Smith entered the water after the ship made its final descent and even assisted someone before disappearing from sight. These stories appeared in newspaper interviews published shortly after the disaster, capturing the public's attention at a time when newspapers competed aggressively for exclusive eyewitness accounts. Yet as official investigations examined these statements more carefully, several inconsistencies emerged. Dates, locations, and timelines did not always match other verified testimony. Some witnesses later revised their own recollections, while others could not be independently confirmed. Modern historians therefore treat these accounts with caution rather than accepting or rejecting them outright. There were also dramatic stories suggesting that Smith ended his own life during the final moments. Despite their persistence in popular culture, these claims are not supported by reliable contemporary evidence. Neither the British inquiry nor the United States Senate investigation reached such a conclusion, and no verified eyewitness testimony provides convincing confirmation of that narrative. As a result, most serious researchers regard it as speculation rather than established history. Perhaps the most revealing fact is not that witnesses disagreed, but that they agreed on one important point. No one can confidently identify the final verified sighting that definitively explains Captain Smith's last moments. Every account eventually reaches a point where observation ends and assumption begins. That distinction matters because history is built not upon certainty where none exists, but upon recognizing the limits of available evidence. More than 100 years later, the image of the captain remaining with his ship continues to symbolize duty and responsibility, yet the precise details of how his own story ended remain beyond our reach. The farther we follow the surviving testimony, the more we discover that the famous image remembered by the world rests upon fragments of memory rather than a single unquestionable record. And once those fragments are placed side by side, another question naturally emerges. If no one truly witnessed his final moments with certainty, How did one version of the story become accepted around the world while so many competing possibilities quietly faded into history? When historians attempt to reconstruct the final moments of any historical figure, the strongest conclusion is not always the most dramatic one. It is the one that survives the closest examination. In this case, more than 100 years of research have narrowed the possibilities, but they have not eliminated uncertainty. Instead of one definitive ending, we are left with several competing theories, each supported by certain pieces of evidence and limited by equally important questions. The first and most widely accepted interpretation is that Captain Smith remained aboard until the very end, continuing to fulfill his responsibilities after the last practical opportunity to leave had passed. This conclusion is supported by multiple eyewitnesses who placed him on the bridge or nearby during the final stages of the evacuation. It also aligns with long-standing maritime tradition, which held that a captain's duty was to remain in command until every reasonable effort had been made to protect passengers and crew. While tradition alone cannot prove what happened, the available testimony makes this explanation both plausible and consistent with his actions throughout the night. A second theory suggests that he entered the water during the ship's final moments and may have attempted to assist others before disappearing. Several newspaper interviews published shortly after the disaster describe versions of this story, and they helped shape public imagination for decades. However, when these reports are compared against official testimony, important inconsistencies appear. Some descriptions conflict with established timelines, while others rely upon witnesses who observed events from considerable distances under extremely difficult conditions. For that reason, modern researchers generally classify these accounts as possible but not verifiable. A third theory, repeated frequently in popular culture, claims that he deliberately ended his own life during the disaster. Although this version has appeared in books, films, and informal retellings, historians have found remarkably little reliable evidence to support it. Neither the British inquiry nor the United States Senate investigation identified convincing testimony confirming such an event, and no consistently reliable eyewitness account establishes it as historical fact. As a result, most serious scholarship treats this theory as speculation rather than evidence-based history. There are also smaller variations suggesting that his final moments occurred in different locations aboard the ship, from the bridge to the wheelhouse or other sections of the upper deck. These differences are not surprising. As conditions changed rapidly, visibility became increasingly limited, and the people who later shared their memories were often observing from lifeboats moving farther away. Distance, darkness, and the passage of time naturally affected what could be remembered with certainty. Perhaps the most important conclusion is not which theory sounds most compelling, but which standard we choose when evaluating history itself. If we require direct, consistent, independently confirmed evidence, then the honest answer is that Captain Smith's exact final moments remain unknown. We can identify what is likely, we can reject claims unsupported by reliable testimony, and we can distinguish between evidence and tradition, but we cannot responsibly claim certainty where none exists. That may feel less satisfying than a dramatic ending, yet it reflects the discipline of genuine historical investigation. Sometimes the greatest respect we can show the past is acknowledging the limits of our knowledge instead of allowing legend to replace evidence. And once those legends are carefully set aside, another question begins to emerge, one that reaches beyond the final minutes of a single voyage. If the exact ending remains uncertain, how should history ultimately remember the man whose name became inseparable from one of the most studied maritime disasters ever recorded? Once the search for Captain Smith's final moments reaches the limits of the available evidence, the investigation naturally shifts toward a different question. If we cannot know precisely how his story ended, what can we confidently say about the life that came before it, and has history judged that life fairly? The answer depends largely on which version of history we choose to remember. In the years immediately following the disaster, public opinion moved in different directions. To some, he became the embodiment of professional duty, a captain who remained committed to his responsibilities until there was nothing more he could do. To others, he became the senior officer ultimately responsible for a voyage that ended in tragedy, regardless of the many circumstances beyond any one person's control. Those competing images have continued to shape his legacy for more than a century. Modern historians generally approach the question with greater caution. They recognize that commanding an ocean liner in 1912 involved responsibilities very different from those of a modern ship's captain. Navigation relied on the technology of its era, wireless communication was still developing, weather forecasting remained limited, and accepted maritime practices reflected the knowledge available at the time. Decisions that appear questionable through the lens of modern safety standards were often considered ordinary by experienced captains crossing the North Atlantic during that period. This does not excuse every decision that was made, nor does it automatically defend them. Instead, it reminds us that historical judgment should begin with historical context. Captain Smith's career cannot be reduced to a single night, just as that single night cannot be understood without considering the broader culture of early 20th century maritime travel. His decades of successful service, the trust placed in him by passengers and colleagues, and the confidence shown by the White Star Line all form part of the historical record alongside the disaster itself. At the same time, it would be equally incomplete to remember him only as a respected captain while ignoring the difficult questions raised by later investigations. Responsible history requires enough honesty to hold both realities together without forcing them into a simple narrative of hero or villain. Perhaps that is why Captain Smith continues to fascinate historians today. His story resists easy conclusions. Every attempt to define him with a single word ultimately leaves out important parts of the evidence. He was experienced, yet experience could not prevent disaster. He was respected, yet respect did not shield him from criticism. He became a symbol of duty, yet the details behind that symbol remain uncertain. These contradictions are not weaknesses in the historical record. They are reminders that real people rarely fit perfectly into the categories later generations create for them. The farther we move from legend and closer to documented evidence, the more human Captain Smith becomes. He is no longer simply the captain from a famous shipwreck. He is a man who spent an entire career building a reputation that would ultimately be measured against only a few unforgettable hours. Whether history has treated him fairly may never receive a universally accepted answer, because fairness itself often depends on which evidence people value most. Yet after examining his career, the disaster, and the conflicting testimony surrounding his final moments, one question still remains unresolved. When every surviving account, official inquiry, and historical analysis is placed side by side, what does the complete body of evidence actually allow us to conclude, and just as importantly, what does it still leave unanswered? After examining the surviving testimony, official investigations, and more than a century of historical research, the evidence allows us to draw several conclusions with reasonable confidence, while reminding us that some of the most important questions remain beyond our ability to answer. We know that Captain Smith was an experienced commander with decades of successful service before the voyage. We know that he received information about ice conditions during the crossing, although historians continue to debate exactly which warnings reached him personally and when. We know that after the collision he consulted Thomas Andrews, accepted the assessment that the ship could not remain afloat indefinitely, and ordered the evacuation to begin. Multiple independent witnesses place him on the boat deck during the loading of the lifeboats, where he continued coordinating with officers as passengers were brought toward safety. These points are supported by official testimony and represent the strongest foundation of the historical record. Beyond those facts, certainty begins to diminish. The precise sequence of his movements after the final lifeboats departed cannot be reconstructed with complete confidence because the number of reliable eyewitnesses became dramatically smaller. Those who later described seeing him often did so from different locations, under poor visibility, and during moments of extraordinary emotional stress. Their accounts deserve careful consideration, but they cannot always be combined into one consistent timeline. This distinction is crucial because history is not simply a collection of memories. It is the careful process of comparing memories against one another, measuring them against documented evidence, and recognizing where confidence ends. The official inquiries conducted in both the United States and Great Britain sought to understand responsibility for the disaster as a whole rather than to establish every detail of Captain Smith's final moments. Consequently, no investigation produced a definitive conclusion regarding where he was during the last minutes or exactly how his life ended. That absence of certainty has created space for legends to flourish, sometimes filling gaps that evidence alone cannot fill. Yet legends often reveal more about the values of the societies that preserve them than about the events themselves. The enduring image of a captain remaining with his ship reflects ideals of leadership, sacrifice, and responsibility that resonated deeply with the public in the early 20th century. Whether every detail of that image can be historically verified is a separate question altogether. As investigators, those two ideas must never be confused. Respect for tradition should not replace evidence, just as skepticism should not dismiss credible testimony simply because complete certainty is impossible. The most balanced conclusion acknowledges both what is known and what remains unresolved. Captain Smith almost certainly remained actively engaged in the evacuation until the final stage of the disaster. His exact location during the last moments cannot be established beyond reasonable doubt. Stories unsupported by reliable contemporary evidence should remain in the category of speculation rather than accepted history. The absence of definitive proof is not a failure of historical research but a reflection of the reality that some moments passed without anyone surviving to record them. More than 100 years later, despite advances in scholarship, access to archival records, and continued study of the disaster, that final uncertainty still remains. And perhaps that lingering uncertainty points toward an even larger truth, one that extends beyond a single captain or a single ship, inviting us to consider why some historical mysteries continue to endure long after nearly every available piece of evidence has already been examined. Some historical mysteries endure not because evidence has never been collected, but because the evidence that survives can only take us so far. The story we have followed is one of those rare cases where careful investigation does not lead to a dramatic revelation, but to a deeper understanding of both history and its limitations. After examining the surviving testimony, official inquiries, contemporary records, and decades of historical scholarship, one conclusion stands above all others. Captain Edward Smith cannot be understood through a single image frozen in time. He was neither simply the flawless hero celebrated in countless retellings nor merely the captain forever blamed for one of history's greatest maritime disasters. He was a professional mariner whose entire career was ultimately judged by a few extraordinary hours during circumstances that no captain had ever faced on a ship of that size. The evidence suggests that he remained at his post during the evacuation and continued carrying out his responsibilities for as long as meaningful action remained possible. Beyond that point, the historical trail gradually disappears. We do not possess a verified account describing his final words. We do not know the exact place where his journey ended. We cannot identify a single witness whose testimony removes every reasonable doubt. Those unanswered questions are not gaps waiting to be filled by imagination. They are reminders that history is sometimes incomplete, even when it concerns one of the most documented events of the 20th century. There is an important lesson in that realization. Modern audiences often expect history to provide certainty, clear conclusions, and definitive answers. Real historical investigation rarely offers such comfort. Instead, it asks us to distinguish between what has been demonstrated, what has been reasonably inferred, and what remains permanently unknown. That distinction is not a weakness. It is the foundation of honest scholarship. In many ways, Captain Smith's legacy reflects the broader story of the Titanic itself. The disaster has generated thousands of books, documentaries, research papers, and personal accounts, yet new discussions continue to emerge because each generation returns to the evidence with fresh questions rather than predetermined conclusions. That willingness to question familiar narratives keeps history alive. It reminds us that understanding the past is not about protecting myths or dismantling them for the sake of controversy. It is about following the evidence wherever it leads, even when the destination is uncertainty instead of certainty. Perhaps that is why this story continues to resonate more than 100 years later. Beneath the famous photographs, the enduring legends, and the countless recreations stands a real human being whose final chapter can never be fully reconstructed. The ocean preserved the ship beneath thousands of feet of water, but it also carried away moments that no investigation will ever completely recover. What remains is not a complete answer but a carefully assembled picture built from testimony, records, and responsible historical analysis. And perhaps that is enough. Because the purpose of investigating the past is not to force history into neat conclusions. It is to understand it as honestly as the surviving evidence allows. In the end, the greatest mystery surrounding Captain Smith may not be exactly how his story ended, but why, after more than a century of research, the unanswered questions continue to remind us that history is at its most compelling when it has the courage to admit that some truths remain just beyond our reach.